In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a clay relief. So that's any sort of a flat clay panel or sculpture. Now, the very first thing that you need to do if you're using water-based clay on a piece of board is to seal the board. So here you can see I'm just using a bit of shellac, sometimes called button polish. I'm painting it all over a piece of MDF, and that is just going to seal the surface and stop it soaking up the water, which would make the board warp. Now I'm going to mark on the extremities of where I want to make my panel, and I've drawn on a square, and then I'm putting some screws in so that I'm going to make the board suitable for the clay to attach itself to. So best way to do this, just put a few screws in, wrap some wire around it, and then when you start pressing your clay onto it, the clay has got something to cling onto. I find it useful when I'm sculpting a relief to have the board upright like this so that you can stand back and look at it rather than have it on the table, because then it's quite hard to get the right sort of perspective on it. So you can see I've got my board propped up on a tabletop easel, and I'm just putting the clay on within that initial rectangle that I drew on, because I know that's the shape of the piece that I'm sculpting. The panel that I'm sculpting in this video is for the Human Made Mark organisation, and this is a campaign that I really wanted to support any way that I could, because they are promoting not using AI in films, and this is obviously something that I am very passionate about, because I worked in the film industry for many years behind the scenes, and one of the things that we used to do a lot, incidentally, was making relief sculptures, because all the sets that you see on a film up until recently are made by hand by people like me, and we used to sculpt lots and lots of reliefs like this, and I thought this would be a fitting thing for me to do, to just shine a little light on this campaign and give it my support. So I'm just going to be sculpting their logo, and I will also show you how to make a basic waste mould once you have sculpted a clay relief. Now here I'm just using a serrated kidney bean edge, and that just helps even out the surface. So I'm keeping it quite sketchy around the edges just to give it that homemade feel, and then I'm using different finish kidneys to smooth off the surface. Now here I've got the logo, and I'm using a piece of tracing paper to carefully draw out the shape of the logo. And then the next thing that I do is turn over the tracing paper and use a water-based felt tip pen and trace over the exact shape that I want. Now, if you're going to do this technique, it's really important that you use a water-based felt tip pen. This will not work with a Sharpie or any sort of permanent marker, because the whole idea is that once you've drawn it on, you can press it onto the wet clay, and the water in the clay will make the ink come off, and then you've got your exact shape that you want to sculpt straight away marked on the clay. This is a really useful hack that professionals use all the time. It just saves time so that you get the exact image that you want directly straight on the clay, and then you can start actually making the sculpt. So here I'm just adding a little bit of texture onto the clay within the marks, and that helps the clay to adhere to it, because if you add clay onto very smooth clay, it's prone to drying out and sort of cracking off sometimes. So anytime you can get a bit of texture on before you add clay onto clay, then that's going to help it adhere. So here you can see I'm just very slowly filling out the shapes with little thin clay sausages. I'm just squidging them on before I then will model them in with a clay tool, and that's what you can see I'm doing here. So I'm just using a little wooden S-shaped tool and squashing it on and modelling it in nice and crisp around the edges and flat along the top. And then once I've done as much as I can with a tool, I just get a wet brush with some water on, and that just helps to smooth it all off and consolidate the shapes. Sometimes a finger can also help to smooth off wet clay. I like working in water-based clay because it is the quickest clay to work with for this sort of thing. You can see here I'm just using a smaller brush just to blend in some of the edges. Here I'm using a heat gun, and that helps to dry it out a bit, because when you want to really get the edges nice and crisp, then you do want your clay to be a little bit drier. Now that I've sculpted my relief panel in clay, I'm going to make a quick plaster waste mould using soft casting plaster, and then make a cast out of hard plaster. So here I'm just using some Vaseline to paint onto the wooden board, and this will act as a release agent so that the plaster will come off the board easier. And now the very first layer is going to be casting plaster, and you want to do a fairly thin mix for this, and I usually put in a little bit of colour pigment just to help you know that that's the layer close to the surface, which you'll understand more when we actually get the cast out. So you can see I just use my fingers to mix up a thin layer of plaster and flick it onto the sculpt, and you want to try and get in all those little nooks and crannies. Once that's on, then I do a normal thickness mix, so that should be a bit more creamy, and I use a brush at this stage, just paint it on. And now I'm putting on some scrim, which is like a loose weave Hessian. Some people call it burlap, I think, in America. And I'm placing it on and then just using the plaster to paint it on. Now you've got to work quite quick with plaster because it does go off really quick. And here you can see I've got what we call ropes. So they're long, thin bits of scrim, and you squidge them into the plaster like that and squidge it all around the edge. So you want to get a rope right around the edge, and then usually do one across it as well. And then use some wooden sticks to just add on to it as well, using the scrim to bind it. You add that on so that you've got a nice solid plaster waste mould. And now I just use a chisel to ease it off the clay, and you can see there's the reverse of it. Now you want to seal it again with some shellac, and then here I've got some Murphy's oil soap, which is what you can use as a release agent, and this will form a barrier so that your plaster cast won't stick to the plaster waste mould. So once it's shellacked and that's dried, and then you've got your Murphy's oil soap on there, it's ready to put in your casting plaster. Now you can see this is called Cristacal. It's a much harder plaster than the soft casting plaster that you use for the waste mould, and this is a very quick drying hard plaster, so it's a nice thin consistency, and you want to pour it in to start off with, just to make sure that it's covering the whole surface. And once that first gel coat is dried, you're safe to back it up again with some scrim. So I'm using a brush to paint it in, and I'm just getting squares of scrim to lay into it, and then doing some little ropes up the side as well. And then because it's quite a thin flat panel, I've just got a few bits of wooden stick to help strengthen it as well, and I'm just laying that inside it as well, and laying some scrim over that, and again painting it in. So you just want it to be as strong as possible, because obviously once this is dry you're going to break off that waste mould, because a waste mould is a one-time use only mould. So that's why it's called a waste mould, because you do actually destroy it and waste it after the one use. Once you've got it as nice and strong and thick as you can, then you're going to wait for it to dry off. You can see I'm just cleaning up the edges a bit there with a piece of metal. You could use an old credit card or something for this, but I use a metal kidney for that. And then once it's all totally dry, I've left it until it's 100% hard, then take off the wooden sticks, and I just use a hammer to gently, off the edge of the table, break off the waste mould. And then you can see here why I put that pigment into the first layer, because you can really easily now see what's the mould and what's the cast. So it's much softer, the mould plaster, so it scrapes off really easily, and you're left with the nice hard Cristacal cast. So you can see there the shellac that has sealed the mould, so it just flicks off very, very easily. A little quick sand off and it's done. And here I'm just putting on a water-based paint wash just to make it look nice and handmade, so that you've got this lovely handmade prop.